All right, kicking off another episode of Zen and Callsigns with another great guest, Dr. John Cordle. Sir, welcome to the show.
Hey, thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Oh, my pleasure. Well, our backgrounds align a little bit. We're obviously around the military. I've spent, I think 2.5 years of my life on Navy ships, which I never thought I'd do as a Marine. So you know how it is. You've spent a lot of time on ships, I believe Aegis cruisers and some nuclear stuff. But you have and I forgot to mention, it's like you have a doctorate, and we're going to touch on these things, and specifically around human factors engineering, which is a very unique and niche subject, and we're going to get into that and talk about that. But I'd love for you to start off with young John Cordle, about to graduate from high school and figuring out what he wanted to do when he grew up. If you could start us there, and then we'll riff to get to present day.
Okay. All right. So you're looking for about 50 years in about 5 minutes. That sounds like a
Yeah,
reasonable
yeah. Maybe you
expectation.
can go a little longer. That's okay.
That's all right. It's not that interesting. So I grew up in a military family. Dad was he was enlisted in the Navy, diver, and then got picked up for officer school and went off and became an ordnance officer. He was in Vietnam for a couple of years when I was in like the first grade, second grade, and then he retired back to his hometown of Rome, Georgia, where I went to high school. And so I went to a private school. My mom taught there. My dad was military, retired, and I had never really thought about what I want to do after high school. I was in a rock band. I was in the choir at school. I was a straight A student. Things came pretty easy to me as far as academically, and all my friends were going off to engineering school at Georgia Tech. And at one point, my dad figured out that band practice and other things were more important than school, and he pulled me aside and said, "Hey, look, knucklehead." He goes, "I was on my way to band practice one night. He goes, look, I'm not paying for college, right? You have straight A's. You have opportunities all over the place. You can live here if you want to. I got a room in the basement, but you have to have a job. You got to eat dinner with the family every night and be home at 10 o'clock on the weekends." And I was like, I don't think I like that plan. And this is like September of my senior year, right? I mean, I'm like months away from graduation. And he goes, I went ahead and took the liberty of ordering this application to the Naval Academy for you and one to Georgia Tech to sort of, and you can leave the house when you filled them out and put them in the envelopes. And so basically, I spent the weekend
And
filling out
about
college
what year was
applications.
this?
1979, right
Okay,
before I
gotcha.
graduated high school. And filled them out, sent them in, got accepted to both. And I this is kind of a weird thing, and it sounds odd to say it this way, and I didn't think of this consciously for a long time, but I have this habit of looking at two options and taking the one that seems the most challenging. And I don't know why. It's not because I'm especially talented or especially smart. I just didn't want to get out of Georgia and do something different than what my friends were doing. And so I signed up sight unseen. Never been to the Naval Academy. Didn't know there was a Naval Academy until my dad brought the application to me.
Do you think it was a little bit of the lore that, maybe some stories from your dad and what he told you in his experience?
I kid that I've only been out of the Navy for 4 years. I was in until I was 16, and then I joined, actually, when I was 14, and then I joined again when I was 18. And so the Navy was, the smell of his clothes coming home from work. Um, but so sorry, he passed away, many, many years ago, but it seems like whenever I think of those times,
Yep.
it kind of hits me hard.
Awesome.
But
Yeah.
he was very calm about it. So I went to the Naval Academy. I show up. I get there for about a week, and I call my dad, and I'm like, "Dad, I screwed up. This is crazy. They're yelling at me. They cut my
Yeah.
hair. I'm not in good shape, and I'm dying here, and my glasses broke, and I want to come home." And he goes, "You're an adult. Make a decision. I'll back you up, whatever you do." And I'm like, "Aren't you going to yell at me? Aren't you going to like tell me, give me some advice or something?" And he's like, "No, I raised you to make decisions." And so I kind of hung up the phone and said, "Well, screw him. I'm going to stay here," and redoubled my efforts. Graduated with a degree in ocean engineering, and then service selection. I actually got to fly in an A4 as part of my midshipman training.
Yeah.
I threw up in it,
Cool.
and I was airsick, and I hated it. And I was like, "Okay, altitude and speed are not for me."
Okay.
So
Yeah.
surface warfare, right? And so I went surface warfare, and again, the option was there for nuclear power, which was the more difficult option, and they sort of courted you a little bit back then, and so I signed up for nuclear power. I'll get back to those days because that's where my poor relationship with sleep started, with crazy shift work and things like that. But I'll
Yep.
come back to that. I
Sure.
went through that, was on multiple ships, nuclear cruisers, like you mentioned. Those are all gone now. Aircraft carriers, destroyers. I was privileged to have command twice, one of an Arleigh Burke destroyer, USS Oscar Austin, named for a Medal of Honor winner, Served on USS Cole as XO, also a Medal of Honor winner. And then my last command tour was on USS San Jacinto, a cruiser. And then I retired. I retired in 2013, sort of the sequestration, government shutdown, hiring freeze. But I found a job teaching for the Navy under a contract. And then I always said if something comes up that I'm more interested in, I'll do that. About 6 years later, about 5 years later, we had the collisions back in 2017 where 17 sailors died. And fatigue was a big part of that. Now, in my Navy career, I had started to realize that being tired all the time was not a good thing and that there might be stuff you could do about it. And so I had started to work in the area of sleep with the postgraduate school with some friends on some research. I had gone out and pursued my master's in human factors and then my doctorate. And that qualified me for this position I'm in now, which is a human factors engineer. So oddly enough, I was back at my 40th reunion here last month, and my classmates are like, here's the guy who was like the last guy to formation every time with rack burns on his face, because he was just sleeping all the time. And now he's like got a PhD and he's teaching sleep. And
Yeah, it's
they
like,
were
duh.
kind of, yeah, right. Hey, stick with what you know, right?
Yep.
So that's kind of my story. And now I do, in fact, this morning I'm headed in to teach a class in sort of sleep hygiene and best practices for one of our ships. So that's kind of what I do now. And there's somewhere out there, there's this little circle of, doing what you love, getting paid for it, and doing something meaningful. And I feel like I've landed right in the center of that. And so that's what I do.
But excellent. Yeah, I think I got the best sleep. So I spent like about 2.5 years on LHDs,
Okay.
and I got the best sleep of my life
Hmm.
on those on that. So I was typically on the night page.
Okay.
So so it was just we were doing that, and between the hum, the cool, typically when the
Yeah.
AC goes out, that's no good. Nobody sleeps well. But the best sleep on the boat, kind of rocking the hum, blackouts, curtains, slept really well. I don't sleep that well now. But yeah, so I would say, when do you think sleep started popping up into, I would say, like the mainstream or collective consciousness of like, hey, let's really focus on this. Let's start to study this because it's such a huge, so I do a little thing where I believe, and I heard this quote where sleep is the ultimate performance enhancing drug. And I'm like, yeah, that's it. Like if you can get good sleep and monitor that, like it does everything. It repairs your body, your immune system, the detoxification of your brain for the beta amyloid plaque, you just go through like memory consolidation and but you're like, what? It's like this incredible thing. So I digress, but I guess where do you think it started to become more prevalent outside of the military and in the military? What was your take?
Well, good question. I mean, I was kind of I didn't really pay much attention to it, really, I would say, until probably my first command tour. So I've been in for 20 years. This is in the 90s or 2000. The postgraduate school had started, one of my mentors, Dr. Nita Shattuck, had started a lot of studies on it, putting then watches on people and studying their sleep patterns on ships and kind of ringing alarm bells that Navy sailors are not getting much sleep. And a lot of this was self-inflicted. It was our own policies and our own, procedures that were doing it, and just an ignorance of science. And so
Yep.
she was kind of ringing that bell for about 10 years. And then in 2010, I was able to participate in an experiment on San Jacinto with what's called a circadian watch. Most of us don't worry about circadian rhythms because our day is kind of work day, sleep at night, come home. If you're a shift worker or a watchtender on the ship, and this may explain why you got such good sleep and maybe others didn't, is the Navy watch rotation for decades, centuries, I guess, was rotating. So in other words, you stood a different watch with a different sleep time every 24 hours. So your body's natural circadian rhythm was just broken daily. And that leads
Yes.
to fatigue. That leads to long-term
Yep.
issues with health, sleep deprivation, sleep apnea, depression, back to, your ties back to suicide and anxiety, things like that. And we were doing this on purpose. And so I tried this watch bill on San Jacinto, and I couldn't believe how well it worked. It went from what they call 5 and dime, which is 5 hours on, 10 hours off, and it rotates, to 3 on, 9 off, and you stay on the same watch every day. So you might be on like 6 a.m. to 9 a.m., and then 6 p.m. to 9 p.m. And then you're off for those, 9 hours to get 8 hours of sleep plus a workout, maybe a meal, and then the other 9 hours you would do work. And we did this, and I honestly never seen anything, back to your point, it's the ultimate performance drug. I've never seen anything make such a difference. I got back from deployment. I was put in a position of leadership, and I was shut down. You know, hey, this is not something that we want to encourage because it'll drive up manning, right? That's one of the excuses. And so I spent my first year after I got back from deployment being sort of just an evangelist for this. And then I was basically told I needed to kind of shut my mouth. And I kind of did, although I shifted my fires over to writing articles outside the Navy and trying to get their attention that way, and got close in a lot of areas and continued after I retired. And then in 2017, the collisions occurred, and both the Navy report and the National Transportation Safety Board zeroed in on fatigue as a causal factor. And suddenly this thing that we had been talking about for 7 years now became policy, and the Navy signed it out, started training on it, and then created eventually the job that I'm in because of that. I think that I kind of joke that a culture change takes about 10 years in the military, and we're still only 7 years
Yep.
in, right? So there's
Yeah.
this urge to declare victory. But when you go out there, the sailors aren't sleeping a lot more now than they were in 2017. We could talk about why, but we have changed the policy. So the ships are in the circadian watch rotation. You won't hear as many bells and whistles and announcements in the morning or in the evening. They shifted some of their briefings to the daytime, especially now with our ships out there in the Red Sea, getting shot at every day. It's incredibly important to keep that focus watch standard on point. And so we're finding the ships have built fatigue into their planning. A lot of our sailors have aura rings now. We put them on all of the commanding officers and XOs as they go through the pipeline. And so they're getting feedback and they're making decisions. So we're turning a corner, but I would say we're at we haven't really made that 45-degree turn yet to get to the 90-degree side of things. But we're getting there.
Yeah, because even in aviation, and I was curious what this is on surface warfare, some number around, 25% of all mishaps are associated with fatigue. That's,
Mm-hmm.
class A type stuff, and
Right.
probably more just because it's difficult to measure, if you will. Is that a similar number in your role?
If you look at the statistics, it's a lower number, but I don't think we ask the right questions.
I
Fatigue is
see.
like one check on a big list of things that are human factors. And if someone is doing the investigation and they're not trained in it, then they don't necessarily look at it, right? Or they'll
Yeah.
ask the question, did you get a good night's sleep? Well, yes. Okay, then fatigue wasn't an issue. That ignores the fact that I have sleep apnea and I haven't slept in the weeks prior. So, but it's about 10 to 15%, I would say. But that's still significant. But my point is, at one level, it's almost always a factor because when you make mistakes, you're more likely to make mistakes if you're fatigued. And so even we know our sailors are fatigued out there, and so I think it's always something to look for. It's always a planning factor, I think. And like I said, I think we've raised awareness about it out there in the fleet, but I think there's sort of a feeling of helplessness that I know I'm supposed to sleep, but hey, I got to get this work done. I got to get this check done. I got to get this this training completed. And that's more important. And so
Yes. Yeah.
culturally, I think we still have a ways to go.
It's an interesting balance that you have to strike with that. We're connected through Rob Sweetman, and so I'd always chatted with him about how pilots work, and certainly when you're flying only nighttime and that you're strictly following that crew day, crew rest. It's like, hey, don't they're the pilot side right there. Don't bother them. Don't slam the door. Right? Sometimes
Right,
we
right.
maybe unplug the one MC. I don't know, but maybe some friend did
Stuff a
that.
sock up in it or something, right?
Yeah. I really tried to do that my best I could. Like I was saying, I did get pretty good sleep for the most part when I was flying, certainly at night, because you could really be on that opposite circadian rhythm because, well inside the ship. So it's like there's no lights on, right? So
Right,
there's nothing.
right.
So it's like you can maintain that better opposite sleep schedule. But yeah, it's just an interesting balance. And so even there's so and I'm it's interesting you mentioned the aura rings for some of the command. And what I've found the most interesting, lots of different data, but I think of it as a cue for me. It is a cue that I don't wear it daytime because I have an older one and I just don't think the daytime monitoring does that much for me. But I wear it at night. Let's just slip it on. It's a cue, but it's been a cue since I've got it of like thinking about my sleep, like, hey, I want to get good sleep or set up my sleep or what, like, Rob mentions the sleep dojo of like bedroom, like a dojo to go to sleep, have all those things set in place. And so like the aura ring is one of the parts of the puzzle. And I think that if you do, the little pieces around sleep, then you simply get better sleep.
No, absolutely. The term, it's not a great term for that, but they in the science world they call it sleep hygiene. So in other words,
Right.
just like you wash your hands to keep germs off, what do you do? So in your bedroom, what I tell folks is, hey, cold, dark, and quiet, right? That's the secret. Number one is drop your thermostat down to 68 at night, summer or winter if you can. Number two, go to IKEA and buy blackout curtains. They come in all colors, and then figure out what are the distractors in your bedroom. When I talk to the ship, I say that, hey, how many of you have a TV in your bedroom? And about half raise their hand. And I say, last time I checked, everything I read says the bedroom's for two things. One is sleep, and the other one is not watching TV. So get it out of there, right? Get your watch, get your iPhone plugged in elsewhere. I will admit that I'm not the best at that. We have a TV in the bedroom. My wife likes to watch it at night, and so typically, we have an arrangement where she watches till she falls asleep, and then I grab the remote and turn it off, and then I fall asleep, right? It's worked for 31 years.
Yeah.
But we do have the blackout curtains, and we do focus on getting the room dark and quiet and cool. So it's funny, I was on a ship giving this training recently, and I had been on the ship 2 years before, and one of the officers was still there from the last time. And I finished my talk, and he's like, and I said, yes, sir, what you got? He goes, last time you were here, you talked about, dark, quiet, and cool. And I said, yeah. And he goes, I did that, and it worked. And I'm like, yeah, I know,
Yeah.
So I think, on a personal note, the last piece of it is I think you got to get your mind ready for sleep. I know Rob talks a lot about this.
Exactly.
Your mind has a tendency to focus on whatever it is that you have to do tomorrow or the next day or that undone task or something like that. And so I find that you're taking a walk, taking a shower, lay down, do some yoga, read a book, something to build that 30-minute transition that your mind and your body are like, hey, it's time to sleep, and build that routine. Just like you do in the morning, get up, exercise, drink something, eat something, whatever. Make the evening routine just as focused on, okay, now's my time to transition into sleep. And you build those habits, right? And I think that's the most important thing of it. But again, back to your point of, if you're just thinking about it in the back of your head, that's half the battle, right? The same with nutrition. If you look at that candy bar and that apple and you think to yourself, I really should take the apple, it doesn't work for me all the time, but at least you have that bias, right? So no, I think that's important, and I really I value Rob. The work he's doing is great. I watch his new site out there. He is making some progress, I think, with the pods, and it's such a no-brainer. But it's just something we still have to work on.
Agreed. What has been kind of the most difficult human factors issue that you've had to deal with, either when you're active duty or now as a contractor?
So human factors is a bit larger than sleep, right? It's the whole piece.
Yeah.
It's the whole body of how do we build the system so that the human can interact with it. And so it's a science in and of itself, and a lot of it gets into like the ergonomics. Can the pilot sit? There's a reason they measured the length of your thighs, right? There's a certain leg length you can't be a pilot because you won't fit in the airplane, right? So that's human factors. There's the study of cold and vibration and heat and things like that, and how they affect your performance. Because soldiers shooting very different in 30 degrees Fahrenheit versus 80 degrees Fahrenheit, things like that. But then there's also the cognitive part of task management. Can I do the things that you asked me to do if I'm flying a plane, standing a watch? How long does it take me to make decisions? What goes into that decision? How many buttons do I have to push? If you go back, I don't know if you were at the time of the Osprey when it came out. It had a very, very complex flight control system to do, both rotor wing and straight aviation. In a couple of the crashes, unfortunately, some of the fatal ones, they went back and did the reconstruction. They found out the pilot was following the sequence of events to correct the problem. It took 22 seconds to complete that sequence, and the plane fell from its altitude and hit the ground in those 22 seconds. So from a human factor standpoint, that was a horrible design because you can't complete the task in the time that you have to do it, right? Because it was so complicated.
Yeah.
And so
the V-22 guys, we all have a saying is that the V-22 will just barely kill you, which I think is apt.
that's horrible. So that's where human factors come. If you look back at the collisions, fatigue was certainly an issue, but on the one ship, the Navy had put a brand new steering system in place that got rid of the wheel and the throttle, like you have on a pilot on a plane, and put it all on an iPad, essentially. And so everything was touch screen. You did everything with your fingers, and they provided very little training. The technical manuals had not been delivered yet, and so the ship was given a new system that, quite frankly, was pretty poorly engineered. And then when they couldn't operate it properly, they basically drove themselves into another ship, killed 10 sailors. And then, of course, the Navy court-martials the captain and court-martials the crew and blames them. and then sort of went back and looked at themselves. And it was really more, the Navy touched on it, but at the end of the day, it was actually a publication, ProPublica, that got a hold of the technical data and came back and said, hey, this is what caused that accident, right? And so that's the other part of my job, is sort of continuing to ring that bell that, hey, we've been down this road before, people died, and we shouldn't put stuff on ships, and we shouldn't build programs and things that aren't supported by the science and the technology and tested with sailors, right? And so we have made good progress there, I think. I'm still not perfect, but, that's the challenge as a contractor, too. You mentioned my time as a contractor. As a contractor, you come to the Navy with your thing and you're told to do that. And then sometimes it's frustrating because you realize that what you're doing, what the Navy tasks you to do, is not necessarily the best version of what you're trying to do. Does that make sense? But then when you go back to them and say, hey, we should be doing this way, they're like, well, you're just trying to make some more money, right? You're just trying to pad your contract. And you're like, no, I'm not. I'm just telling you that what you put in the requirements was wrong, right? And folks don't want to hear that, right? And I hear it now sometimes even from Navy programming. Well, that's not the requirement. Well, the requirement was built 7 years ago before we knew XYZ, and yet we're still building it to that specification. It's like lighting on the bridges of our ships. We put provisions in place after the collisions in 2017 to reduce the glare from lights and panels and things like that. That's great, but our ships were built before 2017, so they're not subject to those restrictions. That doesn't mean that it's okay, right? Because we know that light is a problem, but we don't have to do something about it because the requirement didn't change until after the ship was built. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Now, it doesn't
Yeah, it
make sense
does.
to the pilot, to the operator, right? Because he's like, hey,
Yeah.
this thing's blinding me,
Yeah.
But systematically, that's the way. I call it painting yourself into the stupid corner, right?
Yeah.
You've
Yeah.
laid down rules that block you from getting to the right answer, and you just accept that I'm going to sit in my corner while bad things happen, and that's a bad place to be.
Yeah. Yeah, because so the LHDs, they have NVD compatible lighting for the most part. They can
Okay.
tweak it down really well. So I was I flew V-22s in the Marine Corps, and then I was a contractor for
Oh, I didn't realize
the
that. Okay.
Navy. Yeah, for the Navy for the CMV-22s, and so but I was just a simulator instructor, and the guys would they're like we're all Marine simulator instructors teaching the Navy guys how to fly, and so we're trying to make them be nighttime pilots where they're like, no, we just want to fly daytime, like the cot. And we're like, oh, okay. But then as they go to the carrier, it doesn't have NVD compatible lighting. And so they're just going to the carrier, just kind of like these nuances of, human factors and design and all kind of meshing together. And they're like, hey, can we turn the lights down? Because they're blooming out of goggles because we don't want to put our goggles up right before we come into land. It's because that's also not
Right.
a good idea of transitioning from, so all of those things kind of creep up, and it's like an interesting balance, I would say.
No, absolutely, absolutely. So I think that's my job day to day, is going to the ships and going to the designers and saying, okay, this is on the ship, this is the design. Can we get some sailors in here and test it? Can we get some feedback from the fleet? And so that's a part of my current job. And then the other part, like I said, is sort of the fleet policy. One of the areas, back to your point on the ship, that we talked about was the mattresses and the rack curtains and things like that. I had a sailor on the George H.W. Bush. They had this weird policy where if you got caught for like reckless driving, you got sentenced to jail time, then you could actually serve your sentence on the weekend. So you keep your day job and then just report to the county jail Friday night, spend Friday night and Saturday night, and then they let you out Sunday morning. And so one of our sailors was on unauthorized absence over the weekend for his duty day, and he had not told his leadership that he had spent the weekend in jail. It came out when they sort of did the investigation. And at some point, after it was all over, we were talking. He was a good kid, and he just kind of got in trouble. But he said, "Hey, Captain, the mattresses they had in the jailhouse were actually better than what we have on the ship. Can we get those instead?" And I'm like, wow. And so, mattresses and I get it. When you're so tired on the ship, you lay down, you don't care whether you're on a rock or a pile of newspapers. You just sleep great. But we pay, probably the average American spends $1,000 to $1,500 for their fancy sort of sleeper therapeutic mattress, and then we have our mattresses for the sailors, from the lowest bidder for $200 a piece. And so we've been working on some design changes for that. Of course, they have to meet flammability specs and things like that. Rack curtains, same thing. It's interesting. This is an example of sort of the bureaucracy in place. Is we have specifications for what can go in berthings, and so and we have specifications for what you can have in uniform as far as flame retardants, and they're different. And so the same material that I build my uniform out of, which hangs on my rack, I can't use that material to build a rack curtain, even though it's darker and thicker, because the specs are different for flame retardants. And so we use the same flimsy curtains that you had, years ago, that my dad had probably. So, that's where, Rob and I, years ago, when we first met, we kind of brainstormed over one weekend of, if we could design the perfect rack, what would it look like? And it was, a little bit larger than what we have. It was isolated for sound. It had a circadian, had a light hooked to your watch so you could adjust your light depending on your sleep cycle. You have different, because, the colors of light, the wavelengths of light matter as well.
Exactly.
And we tried to pitch that around, and it's just one of those things that, there's three obstacles to innovation, I think, in the military. One is well, I didn't think of that, so it can't be a good idea. And I don't know how many times, back to the sleep thing is, well,
yeah.
I stood the 5 and dimes watch, and so, my life sucked, so why shouldn't yours, right? And, or I didn't think of, so it can't be a good idea, so no. The other one is, it's just hard, the way we do things programmatically, things happen over years. And so if you want to affect change, the change you start today is not going to come to fruition. The redesign of those throttles I talked about, that started in 2017. The first pair was installed in 2020, and it had some problems. We had to go back and re-engineer that. And so it takes time. And a lot of times the institution doesn't have the patience or the continuity to enact that change and then have it come out the other end and have people realize, oh, this was a result of work that was done 7 years ago. That's part of V22. I think has come a long way over the years.
Yeah.
And of course, they always, pilot error is like the check in the box, but pilot error using a system that was not designed for pilots is not really pilot error,
Yeah. So go ahead, sorry.
That's kind of, some interesting parts of my job. But, one of the pieces I want to make sure that we get back to is this connection you talked about, I think, before we turned the mic on, between sleep, anxiety, depression, suicide. Because the other area that I have started to dive into, and again, I'm not a mental health provider, so I don't want to claim any special knowledge here, but I lost a friend to suicide in Major Command, who I'd gone through the pipeline with. He was a destroyer Commodore. I was a captain of a ship, both at the apogee, the top of our game. And Wade Wilkerson was his name, good and super positive guy, was headed on, I believe, to flag to be admiral, and hit a rough spot when he was in command. And I remember talking to him one day on like a Tuesday at lunchtime. We sat down for coffee, and he was just not himself. He was down. A couple of his ships had done poorly on an inspection, and he was geographic bachelor. His family's up in D.C., had not made it home for a while. And I remember leaving his office that day thinking that something was off, but I didn't know what to do about it. And you think, hey, he's not the kind of person that's going to take his life or do something like that. And sure enough, 2 nights later, he hung himself in the barracks down here. And so for 10 years, I thought about, what did I miss? I carried that with me. And then I went through a class called Safe Talk, which is a suicide awareness class. It's facilitated by someone who's been through the training. And it goes through how to recognize the signs of suicide and then get somebody to help. And so I became an instructor in that. And then I've kind of looked into other things. Cognitive behavior training is one area that I think has promise. We have dogs now on some of our ships as part of kind of getting to the left of things. The challenge is, just like sleep and just like the suicide thing, although there's a difference. In the suicide world, there is a group of people who that's their position, that's their job. In the sleep side, there's really no one in charge, right? There's no one, and the GAO has pointed this out multiple times, that nobody in the Navy says, I own this problem. And because of that, it's tough to get funding, it's tough to get resources, it's tough to get attention, because it's not coming from the top down. So on the suicide side, my sort of frustration is that we tend to overstudy the problem, right? We always say, well, we're gonna do this, and then we got to figure out whether it's going to make a difference. But when you think, that sounds pretty easy, right? But think about how hard that would be in a veteran population to figure out whether this training event or this program was the factor that reduced veteran suicide. How would you even start that? And how long would it take to figure it out? And how would you isolate the effect of this thing? And so our answer, when we can't answer that question, is, well, let's don't do it.
Right.
Right? When the answer should be, in my eyes, let's freaking do it. Right?
Yeah.
Let's try it.
Exactly.
Because A, we can. B, it doesn't cost that much. And, when you talk about suicide, whether it's veteran or friends or family or whatever, it all kind of boils down, I think, to two words: is connectedness and contribution. Do I feel like I'm connected to somebody? One of my friends, a chaplain, said when he went through school, they asked him a question. They said, if you were at that last second, right, the gun's in your hand, the bottle's in your hand, you're driving your car 75 miles an hour and you said, I really want to call somebody to say goodbye. Who would you call? And what are the criteria for that person? And then what they kind of came up with as a group was someone I trust, someone who won't judge me, and someone who cares about me. Right. And then, if a name pops in your head, then you can probably be saved. You can probably stop yourself.
Right.
If
Yes.
no name pops up, if no face pops up when you ask those questions, then you're liable to culminate that act. And so how do we get at that? Well, the way I turn that around when I give the talk is, ask yourself about the people that work with you, people that work for you. If they were to ask themselves, can I trust John? Will John judge me?
Yeah.
And does he care about me? If the answer is yes, then I'm not going to do a bad thing to myself, right? Or I'm not as
Yeah.
likely to.
Yeah.
So we're also doing some virtual reality suicide intervention training where it's pretty cool. There's a scenario, there's a person who's about to kill themselves, and you talk them out of it, or you try to. But we find that 20% of the trainees leave the guy alone at the end of the conversation when he's obviously headed towards suicide. And so how do you get back to that behavior and make sure that people understand that, hey, that's not okay, right? And so I think in the suicide space and in the sleep thing, Rob's friend, I'm sure he talked about his shipmate Ryan, who went into sleep deprivation, into depression, and then alcohol. It's all tied together. And so, and if you find that you have a kind of a will to live. It's funny. I just heard a speaker that you would love to have her on your show, Kajalski. I'll send you her contact information.
Okay. Perfect.
She lost, I think, her father and her brother to suicide, and then she sort of went into a tailspin with her own health and mental health, things like that. And she talks about refocusing her body's operating system on a
Yeah.
will to live. And she says it's not about suicide prevention. That's like the negative view of the world.
Yeah.
It's about
Yeah.
encouraging and fostering a will to live. And she said, your survival instinct is very strong, right? The whole fight or flight, adrenaline, all the other dopamine, all the other stuff. And how do you nourish that, both your mind, your body, and spirit? And so, I heard her speak. It was very compelling, but it really kind of makes you think about, back to your point about veteran suicide and things like that. How could we better connect with our veterans? How could we do it? There's no, I found out the other day in TAPS class, there's very little, if any, mental health training or sleep training or any of that kind of stuff for those that are transitioning out of the service. TAPS is the Transition Assistance Program. So, why not? Why not focus on that? Why not give our veterans the tools to survive on the way out? But we have all this stuff. It's all there.
Oh, yeah.
But getting the this idea that, well, we have to go back and prove it, right, and study it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Is when we all kind of know we all know that petting a dog makes me feel better. I don't need a PhD scientist to study it 9 times to tell me that. So let's just get dogs, for example.
Yeah. Approximately 22 veterans commit suicide a day. We chatted about this before we turned this on. It's proven. It is an epidemic, right? Like, what else would you call that? If guys were in combat right now, 22 a day, that would be right. General quarters, contingency planning. Let's go. Where it's like nothing is done. And I kind of wanted to go into to speak specifically about MDMA. So it was actually kind of on the docket to, if I forgot, it was the VA or it was within the past couple of months to be used or become legalized. I don't know what the details are. And so there's that. But then there's also a very large contingency of veterans, special forces guys that have gone down to Tijuana. That's this group called Vets and a few other organizations. They do a really high-end therapy for a week long. It's had an incredible experience with it. And quite a few guys that have these almost magical experiences. Guys going in suicidal, depression, like really, among other things, and coming out after that week almost cured, like like a magic bullet. And that to me, as I've seen all of these different modalities, you're like, that's an option. Let's go there, right? Let's go there. Where it's like, no, it's like, as going back to your point, it's like, no, got to study. It's like, dude, we have an epidemic. Why aren't we? We have to take steps right now, in my opinion. And so why aren't we? What's your thought?
I think it goes back a little bit to that sleep discussion of it's a problem, but it's not my problem to solve, right? There's a suicide prevention office. That's their job. That's a piece of it. I think a lot of it, I think, is either a lack of understanding or a misunderstanding of, because there's some science behind some of this stuff. I kind of joke that there's two types of people in the world. There's those that have done research and understand research, and those that have not done research and think they understand research. And I was in the latter category for 55 years until I started doing research. And the first course I took in my PhD class was how to do research. So I'm like, oh, I don't need this. And I got in there like, wow, this is a thing, right? You have to eliminate, there's limitations and delimitations and all this other stuff. But at the end of the day, every research project ends by saying we need to do more research, right? That's how researchers stay in business. But operators hang their hat on that and say, well, that means that the research was inconclusive. And you're like, no, the research is pretty clear, right? And so I think part of it is a bit of analysis paralysis, as they call it. Is let's just study the problem some more. There's funding constraints. We have quality of service initiatives that were put in place after the suicides on the George Washington and at our regional maintenance center. But it's not like they added more money to the budget for those. They just took it from somewhere else, right? And in some cases, that taking it from elsewhere had negative implications for your quality of service. Funding is a challenge. The people seem to always be the last thing in the funding line. Back to what the bell I ring on sleep is manning, right? If your squadron was manned at 80% and they're expected to produce 100%, where does that 20% comes from? Sleep, right? They just don't sleep another 2 hours a day. And so we don't even fund the manpower account on our ships above like 90%. And then we don't man to 90% of that. So now you're sending ships out the door with 85%. That's a 2 hour sleep deficit right there. So if you want the root cause, it's self-inflicted, right? By not paying for and then you have veterans who spend their entire time sleep deprived. And then, I find all the time that I have veterans get out and then they discover they can't sleep. Then they get a test. Then they get sleep apnea diagnosis, but they won't connect it back to their service because they weren't tested while they were on service. Now, a lot of them don't get tested in the service because, if I'm a pilot, I'm afraid that if I get diagnosed with a sleep problem, they may take away my flight status. Pilots and doctors don't get along, right? They avoid each other, at least in my experience. Because you might down me for my flight physical.
But yeah, flying, if you raise your hand of like, hey, I'm struggling with sleep or anxiety, anything, like, you're done.
Yeah.
It's not there's maybe a little bit better. I got on 2016 and it's just not, like you're not going to fly, right? You're done right then for a while. You maybe get back, but it's not like there's a exact road.
Well, it's not like a
back.
broken leg or something.
No,
I would say, at least my sense is that's gotten a little bit better. I was just talking to the captain of a ship, the LHD, who's an aviator, who pulled himself out of the flight line in command because of depression. His XO said, look, you're just not yourself. And he checked himself in at the hospital, in with wings in his command pen, and got 2 weeks of inpatient therapy, and then took into counseling, and was back on the flight line about 4 months later. So I think we have broken down some of those barriers, but just in talking to a ship CEO last week, he said there's still a stigma that my folks don't feel comfortable seeking help when they need it. And I think sometimes our senior leaders contribute to that when they poo-poo it, or, oh, he's just allergic to salt water, or they just don't want to go on deployment or whatever. And there's a percentage of that, I guess, but you can't dismiss someone who comes to you with those problems. Well, you're just making it up.
Yeah.
But I have seen more and more senior people who are willing to walk into the mental health clinic in their uniform, wearing eagles or stars, and talk about it. And I think we've made progress on the active duty force. Still a ways to go.
Yeah. Well, you said something interesting about when they were doing the exercise. If somebody, who would be the person you'd want to call to potentially chat with, and what comes to mind is that, and this is a unique value or trait, is vulnerability. Is that if you can be vulnerable, like you're in a command position, you can be vulnerable with your sailors, your Marines, whoever you're with, you're the boss, that you open up a channel for everybody, for them to respect that, to trust you, to do a good job, to do a better job, right? Because there's like that open, hey, he can be vulnerable, I can be vulnerable, we can have an honest dialogue to
absolutely
make things better.
Now that showing vulnerability, that's what when I talk on the ships, I I talk about my own sleep deprivation. When I had one instance in command when I hurt somebody. You talk about failures. We had, long story short, we had folks in one of the small boats, and it was getting late. I've been up on the bridge forever, 10, 12 hours, and we gave permission to bring the boat alongside, and I wasn't tracking where it was and gave a bell order. And on a destroyer with 100,000 horsepower, if you go all back full, you create a giant wave, like a 10 or 12-foot wave. And that wave literally flipped the boat, put people in the water. One was seriously injured, based on an order that I gave when I was overly fatigued. And so that's always haunted me, that when the captain, when the leader puts themselves in a position where they won't admit their vulnerability, won't admit that, hey, I've reached my limit, you could make a decision that could kill people. Especially in the military. I think that vulnerability and that willingness to come back and say, hey, I'm struggling too. And I think it's a fallacy to think, I had an O6 tell me the other day in my class, well, I was up for 48 hours and I was fine. So, this is all BS. And I'm like, well,
Yeah,
first of
yeah.
all,
That
you weren't
hubris.
fine. Right. You weren't fine. You thought you were, but I said, what do you think the first casualty of sleep deprivation is? And he kind of looked at me funny. And I said, judgment, And I said, so your judgment was impaired. That's why you think you were okay. If you'd ask some of your folks who were working
Well
with you
said.
that day, they'll tell you the boss was not okay, right?
Right.
So
Yeah. Well, I'd like you to share. Maybe that's one. There is like, do you have a particular failure that maybe it's that one that you'd like to share from your kind of long experience in the Navy?
I think tactically, that's probably my big one is that one. And I also almost ran aground one time going through the Suez Canal. Almost the same thing. Not paying attention. My mind was sort of zoning out. I was so tired that I missed a bad rudder order. And what woke me up was the commercial pilot yelling in my ears, like, Captain, 1 minute, aground. Captain, 1 minute, aground. I'm like, that's enough, okay? But no, I had two close calls in my career, both related to fatigue. I think strategically, where I kind of kicked myself is we came very close in about 2015, 2014 to turning the corner on this fatigue policy thing. It was up at the flag level, and when push came to shove, I took folks' advice to tone it down and to not be as strident about my calls for change. And so we missed a couple opportunities to turn that corner before people died. That's not on me, but it kind of is, because I chose my own personal sort of career survival over being that sort of pariah to say that the world is burning, and it kind of was. But again, you can say it, but you can't. Sometimes you can't make people listen. And on the tactical failures, I would go back and say I would have told myself, "Hey, knucklehead, get some sleep. You know now how important it is. If your gut is saying this is stupid, if your gut is saying no, if you're thinking about sleep, make the decision, make the hard call, and say, just like you, I can't fly today, right? You would have made that call as a pilot, and nobody would have judged you for it. Until we get to that point in the surface Navy, I think we're still fooling ourselves.
What would be
So
a
yeah, that's kind
restriction
of.
for the Navy to have something how in the way of how pilots operate with a crew day, crew rest style? What are like the structural issues of not being able to do something like
I think you look at the ship schedule, you look at manning, you look at the external causes. You have to be on station, do this event, requires the whole crew up. I think it's not conducive. Whereas a pilot's kind of
I see.
one person, one plane. The ship is a
Right.
living thing all the time,
Yep.
so you can't necessarily do that. But
Got
what you
it.
can do is adjust for it and take it into account, so that before that big event or after that big event, you sort of stand down and catch some rest. And so, yeah, I think that's a piece of the pie.
I see. I'd like for you to share your philosophical operating system. How have you done things over your long career in the Navy, doing, high stakes activities, driving big, ships, cruisers,
Right.
destroyers, a lot of stuff going on, tons of moving parts. So how have you done things then and now?
I think I go back to my dad. My dad gave me some great advice when I joined the Navy. He said, "Son, Navy's pretty simple. Figure out what you're supposed to do and do it." And so I learned that through nuclear power, through my qualification process. Is the way you get good at something is by learning, studying, and doing it, and practicing, and failing, and coming back. And so I think I always embrace failure. I think that's part of my operating system. I always owned it, and used my own failure as an example for others to try to make myself better and for them. I think I'm pretty good about not blaming myself when I make a mistake. I blame myself for a little bit and I own it, but then you look back and say, well, why did I make that? Sort of that analytical piece of why did that mistake happen? And I think a big piece of it is I think if you met someone who knows me or worked with me, they would say, John always has a smile on his face. He always has a positive. he always has a positive attitude about things. The folks on the ship would joke that when I got mad, I would speak German. My wife's German, and so we speak German at home. And Germans have these great cuss words, and but it was such a rare thing that they remembered it. And so, because most of the time, so I think my operating system is, fill your bucket up with sleep, with positivity, and find the good stuff around you, and don't dwell on the bad stuff. I think is sort of that's not a very very psychological definition, but it works for me.
Yeah, keep
I
it
am.
simple. I mean, well
I'll
done.
tell you, I am the most disorganized person that I know. If the camera were to pan around this office, you'd see, and I feel like I'm always on the verge of chaos. But I think I manage to exude calm most of the time, and I think it's that positive attitude that gets that. So that's the closest I can come to that very tough question.
All right. Well, thank you for the explanation. I appreciate it. Thank you for your time this morning, and thanks for taking a little bit to share your life, your experience, and what you do now, and your thoughts, John. So appreciate your time.
No, thank you. I hope we can continue to work together. And if you need an assistant out there in Bali, just let me know. I might hop
Yeah.
on a plane. I can.
It's a beautiful place to be. I highly
Yeah,
recommend.
yeah. Good on you for making that choice. That's awesome.
Thank you, sir. Well, thank you again for being on, and have a great day, and be in touch. See ya.
Okay. Thank you very much.
All right. Bye bye.
Bye.